The final 24 hours, life, death, and the legacy of ADX Florence. The prison that never sleeps. Before dawn even touches the Colorado desert, the lights at ADX Florence are already awake. They don't flicker. They don't fade. They simply hum, cold, fluorescent, eternal. Inside this fortress, time doesn't flow the way it does outside. It loops. Every day is the same hour repeated 24 times, a cycle of order, silence, and survival. For the men who live here, the most dangerous prisoners in America, every breath is monitored, every movement logged, and every sound recorded. This is the end of the line, the final stop for those deemed too violent, too unpredictable, or too feared for any other prison to handle. Officials call it the United States Penitentiary Administrative Maximum Facility, ADX Florence. Inmate slang is simpler, the tombs. And for many inside, it's not just where they serve their time, it's where their time ends. The morning that never ends. The clock strikes 5 a.m., though no one can see it. There are no wall clocks here, no windows facing east. Just a dull light that brightens automatically, a simulation of morning for men who haven't seen the sunrise in years. Guards in black tactical gear move through the corridors, boots echoing against concrete. Each door is sealed tight, each hallway silent except for the hum of surveillance cameras. The building is alive, breathing through vents and sensors. In one of the high-security units, H Block, where the most dangerous offenders are kept, an inmate known only by his case number D512 lies awake. He's been awake for hours, staring at the slit of his window that shows nothing but a strip of gray sky. He hasn't spoken to another human in weeks. Not really. Only voices through the intercom, sterile, distant, robotic. According to internal reports from the Bureau of Prisons, inmates in ADX spend 23 hours a day in solitary confinement. Their only contact comes through food slots and intercom buzzers. Some have been locked in that state for over 2 decades. D512 used to count the cracks in his concrete wall. Now, he counts the seconds between his own heartbeats. The system of perfection. ADX Florence was designed in 1994 as the ultimate solution to violence within the federal prison system. After riots in Marion and Florence, the government wanted a facility that could never lose control. Every cell is built like a vault, reinforced steel doors, electronic locks, motion sensors, and cameras that see everything. The entire prison operates like a clock, mechanical, exact, unfeeling. Doors open only when another door closes. Guards never touch inmates directly. Meals arrive through automated slots. According to a Department of Justice architectural study, the system was intended to remove the possibility of human error. But in removing error, it also removed empathy. Even the air feels automated. Filtered. Sanitized. Odorless. One psychologist who toured the facility in 2015 described it as the cleanest place I've ever seen, and the most lifeless. The psychology of stillness. Psychiatrists have studied the effects of solitary confinement for decades. The findings are consistent and disturbing. After weeks of isolation, the brain begins to change. After months, it starts to deteriorate. Memory fades. Language weakens. Some prisoners report hearing their own thoughts echo. Others say they see faces in the texture of the walls. In the words of Dr. Craig Haney, a leading expert on prison psychology who testified before Congress in 2014, long-term isolation produces not calmness, but deterioration. You are not stabilizing behavior, you are erasing it. At ADX, that erasure is part of the design. The quiet isn't just a byproduct, it's a weapon. A man stripped of sound, sight, and touch becomes something else, obedient, or broken. And for many, there's no difference. D512 once described it in a letter intercepted by prison staff. You start to forget the words for things you can't see. Sky, grass, people. They sound fake when you say them. The Watchers. No prison in the United States is more heavily monitored than ADX Florence. More than 1,400 cameras track every corridor and cell, feeding into the central control room, known to guards as the bubble. From there, a handful of officers operate an entire world through screens and switches. They can open any door, shut down any hallway, or flood a cell with gas in seconds. They see everything, except themselves. One former correctional officer told the Denver Post in 2020. "You're always watching, but you're also being watched. There's no difference between us and them after a while. Some guards last decades. Others transfer within months, unable to handle the psychological pressure of controlling men who never speak." In a 2021 ProPublica report, a retired officer compared it to living in a fish tank full of ghosts. The invisible rules. Inside ADX, there's a rhythm, one the inmates feel even if they can't see it. Each day runs on precision. 6 a.m., food slot opens. 9 a.m., psychological checks. 11 a.m., cleaning rotation. 2 p.m., exercise in the dog run, a concrete pen with no sky view. 5 p.m., mail delivery. 10 p.m., lights dim, but never turn off. The lights never go off. Even in sleep, they are watched. For some inmates, these routines become survival anchors. For others, they're the chains that drive them mad. Letters collected in Baycoat vs. Federal Bureau of Prisons, 2014, show patterns of self-harm and delusion tied to repetitive confinement. One inmate wrote, "The schedule doesn't change. So I stopped. Why wake up for the same day again?" The men behind the number. D512 wasn't always here. He was once a man with a name, a crime, a trial. But the longer he stayed inside ADX, the less that identity mattered. Now, he's a statistic, part of the population that the Bureau describes as the most secure offenders in federal custody. According to unsealed court documents, D512's case had long been forgotten by the public. He'd outlived his notoriety. And maybe that's what broke him, not guilt, not confinement, but being erased. At 10:30 p.m. on this final night, he pressed his intercom button 3 times, the distress signal. A guard answered, monotone, procedural. "State your emergency." Silence. A second response. D512, "Do you require medical attention?" Nothing. Just static, and the hum of air through the vent. The perfect system meets the human flaw. At 11:07 p.m., according to the internal incident report obtained by The Intercept, a motion sensor in D512's cell detected abnormal stillness. A response team was dispatched. They opened the door under full restraint protocol, 6 officers, shields, gas masks, cameras. What they found was a body. No struggle. No blood. Just silence. His suicide note, written on a scrap of brown paper towel, read, "It's not your fault. The walls did what they were built to do." That single line would later appear in advocacy letters from the American Civil Liberties Union, cited as proof that ADX Florence's environment itself constituted psychological torture. The Bureau disagreed. Their official statement read, "All proper procedures were followed. The night that never ends." By 3 a.m., the body had been removed. The cell was cleaned, repainted, and reassigned. The report was filed under medical emergency, resolved. And the prison went on, doors locking, cameras blinking, systems humming. The next morning, a new inmate would arrive. His number would be 1 higher. The cycle would begin again. Because at ADX Florence, there's no such thing as final hours. Only repetition, mechanical, merciless, perfect. And the walls, as always, would keep breathing. The echo effect, how the dead still speak inside ADX Florence. There's a saying among the correctional officers at ADX Florence. No one leaves here quietly. Even the dead stay behind. The day after D512's death, the building felt heavier, though no one would ever admit it. Guards walked their usual routes, the control panels blinked the same lights, and food trays still slid through steel slots with mechanical precision. But something in the air had changed. Not a sound, not a smell, something else. A vibration. A weight that clung to every surface. The silence that hears itself. Inside ADX, silence isn't the absence of noise, it's the presence of control. Every whisper, every step, every key turned in a lock is calculated. And when silence deepens, people notice. The night shift log from that morning, obtained later through a Freedom of Information Act request, noted something unusual. Multiple inmates reported hearing mechanical noises in the ventilation system between 0200 and 0340 hours. Technicians found nothing. The vents were clear, the wiring intact. Still, several inmates refused breakfast, claiming they could hear someone talking through the pipes. To the guards, it was typical post-incident paranoia. To the prisoners, it was something else, the sound of D512 not being gone. In the weeks that followed, reports like these multiplied. Inmates began tapping more frequently on walls, signaling codes to one another, a primitive communication network born out of fear. It wasn't rebellion, it was connection. The human mind will do anything to escape silence, even if the only voice left to answer is an echo. The paper trail. Whenever something happens at ADX, it's documented, written, signed, filed, sealed. But every document tells a different version of the same truth. In the official post-mortem review, the Bureau of Prisons concluded that D512's death was unrelated to facility operation and consistent with pre-existing psychological conditions. Yet internal medical notes, later leaked to The Intercept, suggested otherwise. One entry read, "Patient displayed acute stress response linked to sensory deprivation. Recommended increased human contact." The recommendation was ignored. According to sources familiar with the report, the warden's final note was chillingly bureaucratic. Case closed. Cell repurposed. But those who worked near that corridor said the replacement inmate never lasted more than 6 months in that cell. Transfers, mental breakdowns, or, in one instance, complete catatonia. The cell became known among staff as the still room. Psychological aftershocks. Psychologists call it environmental imprinting, when a traumatic event leaves a perceptible mark on those who occupy the same space afterward. But for guards and inmates alike, it felt like something simpler, haunting. A young officer named Reynolds, a pseudonym used in DOJ transcripts, described it years later. "It's not ghosts. It's memory. The walls remember what happened here. Every time you walk past that cell, you hear the hum differently. It's like the air keeps replaying it." He wasn't the only one. 2 mental health workers independently noted spikes in anxiety, insomnia, and paranoia among inmates housed near D512's former block. Several refused showers or yard time. One scrawled, "Don't let the quiet in," on his mattress with toothpaste. In 2018, a clinical review team quietly relocated every inmate from that wing, labeling it temporary structural maintenance. But the cameras kept running. And in the months after, something stranger began appearing on the feeds. The glitch. At 3:11 a.m. on March 22, 2018, a night shift officer reviewing surveillance footage noticed a flicker in the H-block feed. It wasn't unusual, old wiring often caused distortions. But this one repeated. Same camera, same timestamp, same pattern. A brief static pulse, followed by 2 frames of black, then normal. When the footage was reviewed later by maintenance, the glitch repeated only once, 3:11 a.m., every night, exactly. It continued for 11 nights before vanishing completely. Engineers blamed it on humidity. Guards blamed it on stress. Inmates whispered that D512 had found the cameras. None of it was provable. But as one veteran officer admitted anonymously to The Guardian, 2020. In a place that quiet, even the smallest glitch feels like a scream. Echoes in the flesh. Humans adapt, even to isolation. But the adaptation comes at a cost. By mid-2019, the mental health unit at ADX recorded its highest number of self-reported auditory hallucinations in over a decade. Some claimed to hear clicking or tapping from within the walls. Others described voices, not shouting, but whispering, often repeating single words, still, wait, gone. Clinical staff labeled these as manifestations of stress. But the patterns were statistically impossible to ignore. 37 inmates from 5 different units used the same 3 words. No communication between them was recorded. A Bureau-commissioned psychological review noted. The phenomena appear contagious, not physically, but cognitively. Dr. Emily Vasquez, a consultant hired for the report, later told ProPublica, 2021. It's like the facility itself became a closed echo chamber. Fear travels faster than sound. The guards' breaking point. While the inmates fought the silence, the guards fought its reflection. Many began experiencing what psychologists call compassion fatigue, emotional numbness brought on by prolonged exposure to human suffering. But at ADX, it manifested differently. Not sadness, suspicion. Every shadow looked like movement. Every sound became a potential threat. One officer was found in the control booth staring at blank monitors for nearly 2 hours, convinced that someone was breathing through the system. He resigned 2 days later. An internal email leaked in 2022, later authenticated by the Denver Post, read: "We're not losing control of the inmates. We're losing control of ourselves." The Bureau of Prisons responded with mandatory wellness training and stress reduction briefings. But you can't cure a culture built on constant vigilance. And you can't sleep when silence is the thing that wakes you. The data they tried to hide. In 2021, after mounting pressure from journalists and civil rights attorneys, the Bureau declassified portions of its internal mental health data. Buried deep within the 400-page release was a pattern. Between 2010 and 2020, ADX Florence recorded 76 psychological crises involving hallucinations or episodes of perceived auditory stimuli. 42 of those occurred within 6 months of an inmate's suicide or death. And nearly all of them happened in the same 3 housing units. Coincidence? The Bureau said yes. Psychologists said no. Dr. Haney later commented during a legal briefing. "You can bury trauma under concrete, but you can't stop it from seeping through the cracks." The public didn't hear that quote. The transcript was sealed. But it circulated privately among legal advocates and reformers, fueling a new wave of lawsuits and investigations into long-term isolation practices. The whisper that reached Washington. The echo of D-512's death didn't stop in Florence. It reached Washington, D.C., carried in court filings, media exposés, and congressional hearings. By late 2022, the U.S. Senate Subcommittee on Human Rights launched an inquiry into the psychological and operational impact of supermax conditions. ADX Florence was mentioned by name 57 times in the opening session. Lawmakers read excerpts from leaked letters, whistleblower testimony, and psychiatric assessments. The phrase that appeared most often in those documents: "The silence is alive." It became the symbol of everything ADX represented. Control turned inward until it consumed itself. The new inmate. At the end of that same year, a new prisoner arrived, convicted under federal anti-terrorism statutes, unnamed in public records. He was placed, by random assignment, into the cell that once held D-512. The staff said he'd been calm, compliant, silent. But within 3 weeks, officers noted that he'd begun speaking into the vent. Not screaming, speaking, in low, rhythmic tones. When asked about it during a wellness check, he replied, "I'm just answering." When pressed further, he said nothing. Just smiled. And somewhere, in the air ducts above him, a faint vibration continued. A hum, steady and mechanical, like the prison itself was breathing along. The legacy of the echo. Years later, long after the lawsuits and the leaks, long after new reforms reshaped how the Bureau described isolation management, officers still spoke quietly about the echo effect. Not as superstition, but as truth. Because in ADX Florence, memory isn't buried with the dead, it reverberates through concrete, through wiring, through minds stretched thin by silence. And every night, at exactly 3:11 a.m., the cameras still flicker. A glitch, the Bureau insists. But for those who've worked there, it's something else. The sound of a place that never lets go. The step-down mirage, when rehabilitation becomes control. Every empire of control eventually faces its mirror, an image of itself pretending to be change. For ADX Florence, that mirror came with a new name, a new promise, and the same old silence. They called it the step-down program, the Bureau of Prisons' answer to decades of accusations that the supermax was destroying minds instead of rehabilitating men. The promise of progress. Officially, the step-down program began in 2013 and was expanded after a string of lawsuits from prisoners and civil rights attorneys. The goal was simple: to create a structured pathway for inmates to earn their way out of complete isolation and back into limited human contact. On paper, it sounded humane, a ladder built out of the darkness. But as one internal memo later leaked to the Marshall Project put it, the ladder is suspended in midair. It looks like freedom but leads nowhere. Each phase of the program offered minor privileges: a TV, a book, an hour with another inmate in a small mesh-covered pen. To qualify, prisoners had to demonstrate consistent positive behavior and participate in therapy sessions. But participation required a confession. They had to admit they were the cause of their own suffering, that their mental breakdowns were their fault, not the system's. Therapy through steel. A therapy session at ADX doesn't happen in an office. It happens through glass. The inmate sits in full restraints on one side of a reinforced partition, the psychologist on the other, speaking through a microphone. There's no handshake. No direct eye contact. Just a voice, and the echo of it bouncing off steel. The sessions last 30 minutes, twice a month. Psychologists fill out forms afterward. Engaged appropriately. Exhibited calm effect. Progressing toward phase 2. But behind those clinical notes, a different truth lived. As one mental health staffer told the Washington Post, 2020. We're not treating trauma. We're grading obedience. Some inmates began scripting their emotions, rehearsing empathy, simulating cooperation, saying exactly what the therapists wanted to hear. They learned the system like a code, passing phrases from cell to cell. Talk about remorse. Say you dream about family. Never mention the noise. For many, the program became less a path out of isolation and more a new form of it, a psychological mirror maze built to test how well a person could fake being human after years of forgetting how. Compliance or collapse. To fail the program meant staying in the dark indefinitely. To succeed meant proving you were fit for limited interaction. But success, in most cases, didn't come from recovery, it came from breaking. One anonymous inmate wrote in a letter intercepted by the Bureau's mail unit in 2017. They say if I stop hearing voices, I move forward. I told them I stopped. But the truth is, I just stopped mentioning it. According to Human Rights Watch, 2021, the Bureau internally documented that more than 60% of step-down participants continue to exhibit severe anxiety, paranoia, or hallucinations even after graduation. Yet none were transferred back to medical facilities. They were moved to slightly larger cells, given televisions, and labeled rehabilitated. One former inmate described it perfectly in a later affidavit. They replaced the walls in my mind with a screen. The mask of reform. To outsiders, the Bureau of Prisons began marketing ADX Florence as a reformed institution, a model of humane control. They released glossy photographs of freshly painted corridors, guards shaking hands with psychologists, inmates in clean uniforms. The step-down program was the centerpiece of this narrative. But internal reports told a harsher story. A 2019 Department of Justice Inspector General audit found inconsistencies in how progress was measured. Some inmates remained in the same phase for over 5 years with no explanation. Others advanced rapidly despite repeated disciplinary violations, usually the ones who caused the least paperwork. As one senior officer admitted to ProPublica, 2020, advancement doesn't mean better behavior. It means quiet paperwork. Even the term step down became darkly ironic among staff. They called it step around. Because no one was really moving, not up, not out, just circling within the same walls. A program without exit. There was supposed to be an endpoint, a transition to lower security facilities. In reality, transfers were rare. By the Bureau's own data, fewer than 10% of ADX inmates completed the full program between 2013 and 2020. Those who did were often sent to USP Florence High, a maximum security prison just across the road, a place with slightly larger yards, more voices, more noise, but the same skyless walls. One journalist later called it ADX with sunlight. A psychologist who left the program in 2021 told The Guardian. We called it rehabilitation, but it was really risk management, for the Bureau, not for the inmates. The science of submission. To understand why the step-down program failed, you have to understand what isolation does to the brain. Neuroscientists at Harvard and Yale have studied inmates who endured long-term solitary confinement. They found decreased gray matter volume in regions controlling empathy, memory, and emotional regulation. In simple terms, their capacity to connect had physically atrophied. You can't rebuild that with paperwork. You can't teach someone to socialize after erasing the part of them that recognizes a face. When those inmates were asked to describe what they felt upon seeing another person for the first time in years, one answered, "It hurt. Eye contact, sound, motion, sensations once normal, now painful." The system hadn't just broken them. It had re-engineered them. The Bureau's defense. Facing mounting criticism, the Bureau of Prisons doubled down. A spokesperson told the New York Times, 2021. The step-down program represents a critical balance between public safety and inmate rehabilitation. But internally, morale among staff continued to deteriorate. Emails from wardens to Washington described rising stress levels, chronic staff shortages, and inmate manipulation of therapy protocols. In one message leaked to The Intercept, 2022, a senior administrator wrote, "We have created an algorithm for rehabilitation. The problem is, people don't think like code." Behind closed doors, even bureau psychologists began to question whether the structure itself was a contradiction, whether rehabilitation could exist inside an environment designed for permanent separation. The inmates revolt without violence. By 2022, a quiet resistance emerged, not through riots or protests, but through words. Dozens of inmates began filing handwritten legal motions challenging the step-down program's legitimacy, arguing that it functioned as coerced confession therapy. Many of these filings were dismissed on procedural grounds. But some, consolidated under Rizak versus Federal Bureau of Prisons, reached the Federal Appeals Court. During testimony, one prisoner stated, "They say I'm ready to be human again. But if being human means pretending I'm not broken, then I guess I'll stay a number." That sentence rippled far beyond the courtroom. It appeared in articles, advocacy campaigns, even in congressional briefings on prison reform. It captured what the step-down program had truly become, not a bridge, but a mirror showing the system its own reflection. The new definition of control. By the end of the decade, the Bureau quietly adjusted its terminology. The step-down program was no longer called a rehabilitation pathway. It became part of a broader strategy, behavioral management through structured environment. Different name. Same walls. Because in a place like ADX Florence, even reform becomes a mechanism of control. And when the system learns to imitate compassion, that's when it becomes truly unbreakable. The human contact experiment, when reform turns into exposure therapy. For nearly 3 decades, ADX Florence existed on one rule: no contact means no chaos. That doctrine was sacred, untouchable, absolute. Until reformers forced the Bureau to test what would happen if they broke it. They called the pilot program the Human Contact Initiative. It was meant to be the final phase of the step-down process, a chance for stabilized inmates to relearn interaction before being moved to lower security units. But the staff had another name for it. They called it the experiment. The first touch. The program began quietly in early 2022, with only 8 inmates handpicked by prison psychologists. Each had spent between 10 and 20 years in near-total isolation. They were the calmest, the most compliant, the least likely to explode. For the first time in decades, they were allowed into a shared enclosure, a small yard surrounded by mesh fencing, concrete floors, and overhead netting. No sky. No open horizon. But for men who hadn't seen another face up close in years, it was the equivalent of freedom. When the heavy doors unlocked that morning, the silence was crushing. 8 men stepped out slowly, blinking at the light, muscles twitching as if unsure how to move. Each one carried years of ghosts in his eyes. A psychologist observing through reinforced glass wrote in her notes. None of them spoke for the first 6 minutes. They just stared at one another like reflections. Then, something remarkable happened. One inmate reached out his hand. Another hesitated, then took it. It was a handshake, the first physical contact those men had experienced in years. The guards watching from above said the moment was beautiful. The Bureau later called it a breakthrough in human reintegration. But by the next week, the side effects began. The aftershock. Human contact, it turned out, wasn't relief, it was overload. Psychologists compared it to waking from sensory coma. The body didn't know how to process proximity. Several inmates reported trembling, nausea, panic attacks. One refused to leave his cell again, saying, "Their eyes were too close. I could feel them." Another began having nightmares that someone was in his room, not a guard, but another inmate standing beside him in the dark. He'd wake up screaming, tearing at his bed sheets. The staff logged it as adjustment stress. The Bureau had tried to reintroduce humanity after decades of deprivation. But what they discovered was that empathy, like any muscle, atrophies, and when you force it to move again, it tears. The Observation Unit. To study the effects, the Bureau created a new section inside the facility, the Observation Unit. Here, select participants from the Human Contact Initiative were monitored 24/7 for behavioral analysis. Their interactions were recorded through glass, microphones, and thermal sensors. A senior psychologist who later spoke anonymously to The Guardian, 2023, described the conditions. It was like watching lab rats rediscover light. The inmates were asked to play simple games, checkers, cards, conversation prompts. But the results were unsettling. Many couldn't sustain eye contact for more than a few seconds. One broke down after hearing another man laugh. Another started whispering apologies without reason. The staff documented everything: increased heart rates, tremors, tears. Even laughter, rare as it was, registered as distress on biometric scans. The report's conclusion was stark. Long-term solitary confinement produces a physiological aversion to human proximity. The Human Contact Initiative, meant to heal, had exposed the depth of the wound. The guards' dilemma. While the inmates wrestled with rediscovery, the guards faced their own reckoning. For years, their authority came from distance. Now, they had to stand close, within arm's reach of the very men they'd been trained to avoid. At first, officers wore tactical gloves and kept hands on batons. But as part of the reform's optics, supervisors ordered them to lower their guard, literally. Less intimidation, the memo said. More communication. To the guards, it felt like stripping armor in a minefield. One officer, interviewed later for ProPublica, 2023, said, "We weren't afraid of them hitting us. We were afraid of seeing them as people again." For decades, the job had required emotional detachment. Now reform demanded empathy. And empathy, in this place, was dangerous. Within 6 months, 3 officers requested transfers, citing psychological exhaustion. Another went on medical leave after panic attacks triggered by sustained inmate eye contact. The Bureau dismissed it as stress adaptation. But inside the ranks, they called it the return effect. When the system meets emotion. Not all outcomes were bleak. A few inmates began adjusting, slowly. One, a former gang lieutenant serving a life sentence, started painting during recreation periods. His art, crude, childlike, depicted faces, hands, open doors. When asked what they meant, he said, "Just things I don't see anymore." Another began mentoring newer inmates through the vents, teaching breathing exercises and routines to manage panic. Psychologists saw signs of empathy resurfacing. But the progress was fragile, fleeting. For every breakthrough, there was a breakdown. A 2023 Bureau of Prisons review quietly admitted that positive outcomes remain statistically insignificant. Still, the program continued, not because it worked, but because it looked like hope. The day of collapse. The turning point came 7 months in. 2 inmates, both participants in the Human Contact Initiative, were allowed a joint recreation session. For 30 minutes, all seemed normal: quiet pacing, minimal talk. Then, without warning, one began screaming. He lunged toward the other, not to attack, but to hug. The guards reacted instinctively: alarms, gas, lockdown. In the chaos, both men collapsed. Later reports confirmed neither was seriously injured. But the event triggered a facility-wide shutdown. Officially, the Bureau described it as a brief emotional outburst during reintegration testing. Unofficially, staff started calling it the Embrace Incident. A psychologist who witnessed it said, "It wasn't violence. It was grief. The kind that can't be controlled once it's remembered." The aftermath. Following the incident, the Human Contact Initiative was quietly suspended. The Bureau cited resource reallocation. But leaked internal emails told a different story. One administrator wrote, "We opened the door too fast. They weren't ready for touch." Another replied, "Or maybe we weren't." Within weeks, the step-down program reverted to its old model: communication through glass, contact through walls, empathy through paperwork. Reform had failed not because it was wrong, but because it was incompatible with the architecture of control. The unintended revelation. Despite its end, the experiment left a legacy the Bureau couldn't erase. The data collected during those months proved what critics had claimed for years. Long-term isolation causes permanent psychological damage. It rewires the brain to fear what it once needed: touch, voice, connection. The report's final paragraph, later leaked to Human Rights Watch, read: "In attempting to reintroduce humanity, the system exposed its absence." It was the closest the Bureau had ever come to admitting guilt. But the admission was buried, classified, and filed away under behavioral study #47A. The public never saw it. The inmates never knew it existed. And the guards, those who stayed, went back to silence. Still, every once in a while, when a psychologist passed through that empty therapy room, they could swear they heard faint echoes of laughter, awkward, strained, fragile, the sound of men remembering, for a moment, what it meant to be human. Disclaimer. This story is a dramatized adaptation inspired by real events. Some names, places, and details have been changed for privacy. Information is drawn from verified public sources, including The Guardian, 2023, ProPublica, 2023, Human Rights Watch, 2023, The Marshall Project, 2022, and Bureau of Prisons internal documents. The Whistleblower's Dilemma: Secrets from Inside the Walls. The Human Contact Initiative was supposed to prove that ADX Florence could evolve. But what it really proved, quietly, scientifically, and beyond denial, was that the system had built its own kind of cruelty. And then, just as the Bureau of Prisons tried to bury the results, someone on the inside decided they'd had enough. The leak that shouldn't exist. In early 2024, an encrypted drive arrived at the offices of The Intercept. No return address. No name. Just a handwritten note inside the package. The truth is in the data. Look at Study 47A. Inside the drive were hundreds of pages of Bureau documents. Emails, behavioral reports, biometric charts from the Human Contact Initiative, and video logs from observation cells that were never meant to see daylight. It was the most significant leak in the history of the federal prison system. At first glance, the documents looked dry, statistical, columns of numbers, acronyms, coded facility identifiers. But buried inside the data was a pattern. Every inmate exposed to the contact sessions had displayed symptoms identical to post-traumatic stress disorder. Some suffered tremors. Others developed what psychiatrists called touch aversion psychosis. And yet, every official summary ended with the same line: no adverse psychological effects recorded. The Bureau had rewritten the truth into silence. The psychologist who couldn't stay quiet. The whistleblower was identified later only as Dr. L., a clinical psychologist who had worked at ADX for nearly 7 years. In an interview given under anonymity, she said the decision to leak wasn't heroic, it was necessary. "We were told to call trauma progress. We were told that if someone broke down, that meant the program was working. I realized we'd created a laboratory for despair." Her notes detailed what the Bureau had erased from the official reports: panic attacks, crying fits, violent self-stimulation after group sessions, even suicide ideation triggered by laughter. The very act of seeing another person had reopened wounds that isolation had only numbed. Dr. L. tried to raise her concerns through internal channels. The response came 2 days later in a short email. "Cease unsolicited commentary. You are to follow chain of command." That was the moment she copied the entire behavioral archive onto an external drive. It took her 3 minutes. And it would cost her everything. The chain reaction. When The Intercept published the first report, titled, "Inside America's Contact Experiment," the story detonated across the media. Cable news showed blurred clips from the leaked videos, inmates flinching away from touch, rocking back and forth after brief human interaction. Newspapers ran front-page headlines comparing ADX Florence to Cold War isolation experiments. In Washington, lawmakers demanded hearings. The Bureau responded the only way it knew how, by denying everything. A press release described the leak as an ongoing act of sabotage by a disgruntled contractor. But off the record, senior officials scrambled to contain the fallout. Within 48 hours, all internal servers containing behavioral study data were locked down. Employees were ordered to undergo forensic audits of their laptops. Dr. L was suspended without pay pending investigation. Her security clearance was revoked. The official reason: breach of confidentiality. But she had already sent copies of the data to multiple journalists and legal groups. The truth was out, and it had a pulse. The public outrage. Human rights organizations seized on the revelations. Amnesty International called the findings proof of psychological torture under a bureaucratic disguise. The United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture demanded an independent review of U.S. supermax facilities. And for the first time in its history, the U.S. House Judiciary Committee summoned Bureau of Prisons officials to testify under oath about ADX Florence. During the hearing, Representative Lisa McKenzie held up a printout of the leaked biometric graph, heart rate spikes, redlined under the label Subject 04. "This isn't rehabilitation," she said. "It's human experimentation." The Bureau's director responded with calm denial. "We categorically reject the suggestion that any program at ADX constitutes unethical treatment." But the data didn't lie. It was math that screamed. The counterattack. The Bureau launched an internal investigation, Operation Integrity Shield, to identify the source of the leak. Dozens of employees were questioned, emails were subpoenaed. Whistleblower hotlines were quietly shut down, pending security review. Dr. L went underground, living out of motels in New Mexico and communicating with reporters through encrypted apps. She released a second cache of files, over 600 pages of communications between Bureau officials discussing strategic narrative management. One memo read: "We must emphasize themes of progress and safety. Public perception of reform outweighs operational detail." Another, marked confidential, internal use only, proposed renaming solitary confinement to controlled environmental housing. Rebranding cruelty had become policy. The world starts watching. By mid-2024, the story reached Europe. Documentaries aired on the BBC and ARTE, framing ADX Florence as the modern symbol of psychological imprisonment. The European Court of Human Rights cited the leak as justification for refusing extradition of several suspects to the US. International pressure mounted, and for the first time, the phrase, "close ADX," began trending on social media. Back home, the Bureau remained silent. But silence, as always, spoke volumes. Behind the scenes, officials debated closing sections of the facility. Instead, they launched a task force, Project Rebuild, to modernize the approach to inmate wellness. The reforms sounded familiar: new therapy modules, enhanced lighting, additional staff training. Different names. Same walls. The consequences of truth. For Dr. L, the truth came with exile. Federal prosecutors filed charges under the Espionage Act, arguing that the leaked files contained sensitive operational data. Civil rights groups called it retaliation. Her legal team called it history repeating itself. During a televised interview before her trial, she said, "They told us the inmates were the experiment. But I think the whole prison was. And the country didn't want to see what it built." She was sentenced to 18 months for unauthorized release of classified material. Ironically, she served her time in solitary confinement at a lower security facility. Her final statement before sentencing: "If silence is safety, then truth is rebellion." The legacy of the leak. The data from Study 47A never disappeared. It lives in congressional archives, in news databases, in university research. It became the foundation for new legislation, the Solitary Confinement Reform Act, reintroduced in 2025 with bipartisan support. It hasn't passed yet. But for the first time, the public knows what the inside of a supermax looks like when you strip away the myths. Men talking to shadows, doctors turning trauma into metrics, and a psychologist who risked everything to remind the world that silence isn't order, it's decay. The trial of silence: how one courtroom tried to break the wall. By the summer of 2025, the story of ADX Florence was no longer confined to the shadows of the Rocky Mountains. It was everywhere, in headlines, documentaries, classrooms, and political speeches. But while the world debated ethics and reform, one woman stood alone in a federal courtroom, accused not of cruelty, but of telling the truth about it. Her name, sealed in official filings as Dr. L, became both a ghost and a symbol, the psychologist who broke the silence of the world's most secretive prison. The courtroom without emotion. The trial began in Washington, D.C., Under the Espionage Act of 1917, a law originally designed for spies and traitors, now used against a whistleblower. The prosecution's case was simple. She had stolen and distributed classified federal data, compromising the integrity and safety of a national security institution. The defense's case was simpler still. She told the truth. Reporters from The Washington Post, The Guardian, BBC, and ProPublica filled the gallery. Every seat was taken, every camera banned. The courtroom was silent, a fitting irony for a case born out of silence itself. When Dr. L entered, she looked small against the backdrop of flags and polished wood. But her eyes held the kind of calm that only comes from someone who's already lost everything. She refused plea deals, refused to cooperate, refused to apologize. Her first words on record: "If I'm guilty of anything, it's of remembering that human beings are not data." The prosecution's narrative. The government's argument was methodical, calculated, like the institution it defended. They presented a timeline of events, a chain of evidence showing that Dr. L had accessed and exported Behavioral Study 47A, which contained classified biometric and psychological data. They called it a reckless act that endangered staff and inmates alike. When the prosecution's lead attorney, Michael Reeve, took the floor, his tone was razor-sharp. Dr. L did not act as a reformer. She acted as a thief. Her decision to bypass every ethical protocol and release sensitive data to the media endangered national security. He walked to the evidence display, a screen showing still frames from the leaked footage. "These images," he said, "are not heroism. They are chaos. And chaos is not reform." The implication was clear: Dr. L wasn't a whistleblower, she was an arsonist in a system made of dry paper. The defense fights back. Her attorney, Rachel Porter, was young, relentless, and unflinching. She didn't deny the leak, she reframed it. "This isn't espionage. This is exposure." She pointed to the official bureau emails, obtained through discovery, that used phrases like narrative management, optical containment, and public distraction strategy. She argued that the government's obsession with secrecy had created a humanitarian crisis disguised as security. When Porter held up one of Dr. L's confiscated reports, a clinical evaluation labeled Subject 07, Panic Response During Human Contact Session, the courtroom fell still. "If telling the truth about this is a crime," she said softly, "then so is being human." Testimonies from the inside. The defense called 3 witnesses, all former bureau employees. One was a retired corrections lieutenant who'd worked in ADX for 19 years. He testified under subpoena, his voice trembling. "We were told to ignore them. To treat every breakdown as manipulation. But they weren't manipulating us. They were falling apart." The second witness, a psychologist who had resigned months after the Human Contact Initiative, described seeing inmates collapse after touching another person for the first time in a decade. "You don't fake that," she said. "You don't fabricate trauma." The third was unexpected, a former ADX inmate, now released after serving 22 years. He appeared by video feed, his face half-shadowed, voice shaking. "I don't know her," he said. "But because of her, the world knows us. That's enough." When his testimony ended, the judge called for recess. Even the prosecutors didn't look up. The Bureau's shadow. Outside the courtroom, the Bureau of Prisons launched a quiet campaign to discredit Dr. L. Leaked talking points instructed staff to refer to her as a disgruntled former employee with a history of misconduct. But no misconduct existed on record before the leak. Meanwhile, opinion polls across the country showed a deep divide. 46% saw her as a traitor who jeopardized national security. 49% saw her as a hero who exposed state-sanctioned psychological abuse. The remaining 5% didn't know what to think, only that something in the American justice system felt wrong. Even within Congress, the leak had shaken alliances. Progressives saw it as proof of a carceral system gone mad. Conservatives viewed it as an attack on law enforcement. But beneath the politics, the public couldn't unsee what it had seen: the trembling hands, the haunted faces, the silence that screamed louder than any riot. The cross-examination. On the 7th day of the trial, Dr. L took the stand. She spoke without notes, her voice steady, her eyes direct. "I watched men crumble after seeing another person's face. I saw laughter cause panic. I filed the reports. they buried them. And when they told me to lie, I decided that silence was the real betrayal. The prosecutor tried to cut in. Doctor, you swore an oath to confidentiality. She interrupted. And they swore an oath to humanity. The judge ordered her to restrain herself, but by then it didn't matter. Her words had already left the room. They belonged to history. The verdict. After 12 days, the jury deliberated for 6 hours. The verdict. Guilty on one count of unauthorized disclosure of classified information. Not guilty on all other charges. She was sentenced to 18 months in federal custody, reduced from the original maximum of 10 years. The judge, visibly conflicted, stated, "This court acknowledges both the gravity of your actions and the gravity of the truth you revealed. Justice must punish, but it must also remember." When the sentence was read, Dr. L didn't flinch. She simply nodded, then said one final sentence before being led away. "You can cage the body. You can't reclassify the truth." The nation reacts. Outside, crowds gathered. Some carried signs reading, "Justice for Dr. L." Others shouted, "Traitor." The air itself felt divided, one half mourning, the other defending the system that demanded obedience. Editorials debated her legacy. The New York Times called her the woman who opened the iron door. Fox News called her a danger to law enforcement morale. The Atlantic wrote a single headline: "The silence on trial." Internationally, her conviction sparked outrage. Amnesty International released a statement saying, "Dr. L did not expose state secrets. She exposed state suffering." The European Parliament passed a resolution calling on the United States to reconsider the moral legitimacy of supermax incarceration. But the Bureau didn't respond. ADX remained open, colder, quieter, and more isolated than ever. After the sentence, Dr. L was sent to a low-security federal facility in Illinois. Fittingly, she was placed in administrative segregation for her own safety. Solitary confinement. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Her letters from prison were brief, written in neat block print. One line appeared in every letter: "Tell them I was right." When she was released in late 2026, she disappeared from public view. No interviews, no books, no public appearances. But in academic circles, her name became legend, the subject of ethics lectures, documentaries, and debates about conscience versus law. The trial's real verdict. The government won the case. But the Bureau lost its secrecy. And ADX Florence lost its myth of perfection. In the years that followed, reforms began to creep in, slow, reluctant, often symbolic. Yet every hearing, every protest, every op-ed about prison reform carried a shadow of her words. Silence isn't safety. It's decay. Those words became etched into the public consciousness, quoted in activist banners and political speeches alike. Dr. L had been punished for breaking the silence. But in doing so, she made sure it could never be restored. The rebuilding, how the world tried to redefine justice after ADX. When the dust from Dr. L's trial finally settled, what lingered wasn't just outrage, it was reflection. For the first time in decades, the conversation around punishment and justice had escaped the courtroom, the prison yard, and the headlines. It had entered homes, universities, and legislatures around the world. People were asking the question ADX Florence had forced humanity to confront. What does justice become when mercy disappears? The system cracks. In the months following Dr. L's sentencing, the Bureau of Prisons faced an avalanche of scrutiny. Congressional hearings multiplied. The Department of Justice authorized an independent review of all supermax facilities. And for the first time since its construction, external auditors, civilian, academic, and international, were allowed inside the walls of ADX Florence. Their findings were explosive. Reports detailed chronic understaffing, falsified psychological evaluations, and decades of administrative manipulation. One internal memo, obtained by ProPublica, 2026, revealed that mental health assessments had been edited to avoid triggering human rights violations under international law. It was bureaucratic cruelty disguised as efficiency. The public called it the Florence Files. The Bureau called it context taken out of proportion. But the cracks were visible now, and they ran straight through the foundation of America's most secure institution. The international shockwave. Across the Atlantic, Europe reacted first. In 2026, the European Court of Human Rights issued a historic ruling. No extradition shall be permitted to facilities where conditions mirror those of ADX Florence. The decision forced the United States to offer diplomatic guarantees for every future extradition case. Canada, Australia, and New Zealand followed suit, revising bilateral agreements to ensure humane confinement standards. Suddenly, the fortress in Colorado had become a global embarrassment, a stain on the image of American justice. The UN Human Rights Council went further, issuing a special resolution condemning the practice of indefinite solitary confinement as psychological torture. In the text, one line stood out. The revelations surrounding ADX Florence serve as a warning that control, when left unchecked, becomes corrosion. The reformers rise. Inside the United States, a coalition of psychologists, lawyers, and former inmates formed the Florence Project for Justice, a nonprofit dedicated to ending long-term solitary confinement. They were joined by surprising allies, retired wardens, ex-guards, even bureau administrators haunted by what they'd seen. Their first campaign was symbolic but powerful: Open the Doors 15. It called for a federal law limiting solitary confinement to 15 consecutive days, in line with UN standards. Petitions flooded Congress. Celebrities, academics, and faith leaders rallied behind it. And though the bill stalled in the Senate, it planted a seed that wouldn't die. In interviews, activists repeated a single phrase born from Dr. L's testimony. Silence isn't safety. It's decay. It became the movement's rallying cry. A reminder that justice cannot exist where humanity is muted. Inside the walls. Reform came slowly, almost grudgingly. But by 2027, change had begun. The Bureau of Prisons announced operational restructuring at ADX Florence, an official euphemism for dismantling parts of the old system. The most extreme isolation units, H Block and Range 13, were partially closed. New guidelines mandated at least 4 hours of out-of-cell time per day for every inmate. Therapy rooms were redesigned with transparent partitions instead of steel barriers. And, for the first time in its 30-year history, the facility introduced a family communication pilot, allowing supervised video calls between inmates and relatives. To outsiders, these changes seemed minor. To those who'd lived the silence, they were seismic. A journalist who visited in 2028 described the transformation. It still feels like a tomb. But for the first time, the tomb has air. The culture shift. The reforms didn't just change policy, they changed people. Younger correctional officers began entering the field not as enforcers but as professionals trained in trauma psychology. Training academies introduced courses on empathy and stress de-escalation. In an interview with The Atlantic, 2028, one rookie officer said, "I joined to keep people safe, not to watch them disappear." Still, not everyone accepted the change. Old guard officers viewed the reforms as weakness. Some retired early, muttering that the Florence we knew is gone. And in a way, they were right. The Florence they knew was never meant to last. It had been built on fear, and fear had finally run out of air. The legacy of Dr. L. 2 years after her release, Dr. L resurfaced. Not in the news, not on camera, but in the footnotes of a new book published under the pseudonym A. Lane. Its title, The Walls Remember. The book blended psychology and confession, describing how isolation rewires empathy, not just in inmates, but in everyone who touches the system. It became a global bestseller, translated into 14 languages, cited in law schools, and discussed in parliaments. When asked in a rare interview why she returned to public life, she said, "Because silence keeps rebuilding itself. You have to keep breaking it, over and over, until people finally listen." She refused royalties, donating every dollar to the Florence Project for Justice. Her only public statement ended with the same words from her trial. "You can cage the body. You can't reclassify the truth. The world redefines justice." By 2030, nations across Europe and the Americas had passed new prison reform laws limiting solitary confinement and mandating transparency in mental health reporting. The United Nations launched the Global Humane Custody Initiative, funding alternative rehabilitation programs based on psychology, not punishment. And though the United States never closed ADX Florence entirely, it did something unthinkable. It opened it to journalists, researchers, and oversight boards. Visitors described the new ADX as half museum, half warning. A sign at the entrance read, "Built to contain violence. Remembered for what it contained in silence." The reflection. When historians look back on the early 21st century, they no longer see ADX Florence as merely a prison. They see it as a mirror, one that forced societies to confront what they become when fear replaces empathy. The men who lived and died inside its walls are mostly forgotten, their numbers erased by time. But their existence reshaped how the world defines punishment, justice, and humanity. And somewhere in the Colorado desert, the concrete still stands, cracked, sun-bleached, humming softly with the memory of voices once forbidden to speak. Not ghosts, not legends, just echoes of truth refusing to die. The monument of silence, the final reckoning of ADX Florence. By the time 2032 arrived, ADX Florence was no longer the fortress of invincibility it once was. The name still carried a chill, an echo of fear, of discipline, of the nation's obsession with absolute control, but the myth had crumbled. What remained was something quieter, stranger, and far more human, a monument to everything that had gone wrong when punishment outgrew purpose. The end of the line. The official closure announcement came on a Wednesday morning in June. The U.S. Department of Justice released a brief statement. Due to structural and operational inefficiencies, the United States Penitentiary Administrative Maximum Facility, ADX Florence, will be phased out within 24 months. All inmates will be transferred to facilities in compliance with updated federal standards of humane confinement. No apology. No admission of guilt. Just bureaucratic punctuation on a 3-decade experiment in control. Yet for millions who had followed its story, the meaning was clear: the machine had finally stopped humming. The pilgrims of truth. In the months after the announcement, something unexpected happened. Journalists, academics, and former correctional officers began traveling to Florence, Colorado, not to report, but to remember. They stood outside the gates, taking photos of the silent compound under the endless blue sky. Some called it the pilgrimage of silence. Among them were survivors, men who had lived inside those walls for years. They came in old cars, buses, on foot. Some brought families, others came alone, uncertain what to feel. One, a former inmate known publicly as Marcus "Red" Allen, told The Guardian, 2032. "That place broke me. But standing here, I think maybe it didn't win. Maybe we all came out to bury it together." The museum proposal. By late 2033, activists and historians petitioned Congress to preserve part of the complex as a memorial museum, not to glorify punishment, but to document it. They envisioned exhibits on human psychology, isolation, and the ethics of incarceration. The proposal met fierce opposition. Former law enforcement unions called it a national humiliation. Victims' rights groups said it risked romanticizing monsters. But others saw it differently. Dr. Elaine Parker, one of the original Florence Project members, argued in testimony. "We don't preserve it to honor them. We preserve it to remind ourselves of how easy it is to forget humanity when systems stop listening." The bill passed narrowly in 2034. A portion of ADX Florence was redesignated as the National Museum of Justice and Memory. For the first time in history, a supermax prison became a classroom. The Museum of Justice and Memory. Visitors enter through what used to be the H-Unit corridor, the same passage that once held the nation's most dangerous men. Now, motion sensors trigger dim lights as they walk through. The first sound they hear is a recording of air flowing through vents, that constant hum that defined life inside. Interactive displays show declassified documents, including excerpts from Behavioral Study 47A and transcripts from Dr. L.'s trial. One exhibit plays her words in a continuous loop. "You can cage the body. You can't reclassify the truth. There are no wax figures, no cells staged for spectacle. Only concrete, light, and memory." Visitors often describe the experience the same way: it's too quiet. And that's the point. The forgotten and the forgiven. Outside the museum, a memorial garden stretches across what was once the recreation yard. Plaques bear no names, only numbers. Each one corresponds to an inmate who lived or died in isolation, their identities protected but their existence acknowledged. Every year on June 10th, a vigil is held. Families of victims, former inmates, psychologists, and correctional officers gather together. For one night, the walls of silence dissolve into shared breath. There are no speeches. Only candlelight and the low wind sweeping across the desert. In 2035, a young boy placed a note beneath one of the plaques. It read, "My father worked here. He said it made him forget how to talk. I hope he's listening now." The global ripple. The story of ADX Florence became a case study across the world. Universities taught it under subjects like ethics in systems design and the psychology of isolation. The United Nations Office on Crime and Justice Reform cited its legacy as proof that extreme control leads to systemic collapse. New prisons built after 2035 were designed with transparency, oversight, and built-in mental health wards. Some nations abolished solitary confinement entirely, replacing it with restorative justice centers focused on reintegration and rehabilitation. The shadow of ADX Florence stretched across continents, a cautionary silhouette cast by concrete and silence. The return to dust. In 2036, demolition began on the remaining structures. The cell blocks came down one by one, crushed under the weight of machines far louder than any sound ever heard inside those walls. The last section to fall was the control tower, the bubble. Reporters noted that when it collapsed, the sound echoed across the valley like thunder. And then there was nothing. A desert wind swept through the ruins, carrying dust, papers, and fragments of steel. By sunset, it looked as if the prison had never existed at all. All that remained was the memorial wing, the museum, standing alone against the fading light. A monument not to strength, but to the fragility of systems that forget their own purpose. Epilogue, the voice that remains. Years later, a journalist interviewing visitors asked a woman why she came. She said she was a student of psychology, studying the architecture of punishment. When asked what she learned, she paused, looked around at the gray walls and the quiet corridors, and said, "That silence was never empty. It was full of everything we refused to hear." Her voice trembled, not from fear, but from recognition. Because the legacy of ADX Florence isn't written in reports or trials or even reform laws. It lives in that pause between words, the moment when a society must decide whether justice means control or understanding. And somewhere, carried on the Colorado wind, you can almost hear a whisper, faint but certain, echoing across what was once the most dangerous prison in the world. Silence isn't safety. It's decay. Disclaimer. This story is a dramatized adaptation inspired by real events. Some names, places, and details have been changed for privacy. Information is drawn from verified public sources, including The Guardian, 2032 to 2035, ProPublica Archives, United Nations Human Rights Council reports, 2030 to 2035, and U.S. Department of Justice reform statements.